There is a moment in every inner journey when nothing happens. No breakthrough, no insight, no sign that you are moving forward. And for the modern mind, this feels unbearable. We have been trained to believe that growth is loud, that transformation announces itself, that if nothing is changing on the surface, then something must be wrong. But the quiet trial begins precisely here. In many fairy tales, the heroine is not tested by dragons or labyrinths. She is tested by stillness, by waiting, by being unable to act, speak, or explain herself while the world moves on without her. This is not a failure of the story. It is the story. The quiet trial is the moment when the ego loses its favorite tools. No strategies, no narratives, no performance of strength or intelligence, only presence. Silence in this sense is not emptiness, it is exposure. When you are forced into stillness, the distractions fall away, and what remains is uncomfortable. Old fears, unanswered questions. A sense of smallness the ego would rather outrun than face. That is why we rush to fill the silence, with noise, with opinions, with constant movement. But the fairy tale suggests something unsettling, that the inability to sit in silence is not a personality trait. It is a psychological defense. The quiet trial asks for a different kind of courage. Not the courage to act, but the courage to refrain. Not the courage to speak, but the courage to listen without knowing what you will hear. In this phase, nothing is demanded of the heroine except endurance. Not passive resignation, but conscious containment. She does not move because moving would be premature. She does not speak because speaking would interrupt something deeper that has not yet formed. This is the moment when the soul begins its work beneath awareness, when meaning is not produced, but gestated. And the unsettling truth is this: if you escape this trial too quickly, you may remain active your entire life without ever becoming mature. The quiet trial does not look heroic, but it is often the threshold where real transformation quietly begins. At first glance, the silent heroine looks powerless. She does not defend herself. She does not explain. She does not correct the misunderstanding that surrounds her. And for the modern mind, this feels wrong. We are taught that silence is complicity, that if you do not speak, you disappear, that your worth must be asserted, clarified, defended, constantly. So why in so many fairy tales does the heroine refuse to speak even when silence costs her everything? Because her silence is not imposed. It is chosen. The heroine does not speak because speech at this stage would be a betrayal of the inner process unfolding within her. Words would give shape too early to something still forming in darkness. Speech belongs to the ego. Silence belongs to the soul. When the heroine remains mute, the ego is stripped of its most familiar weapon: explanation. No story to justify herself, no narrative to manage how she is seen. And that is precisely the point. In Jungian terms, this moment represents a withdrawal of psychic energy from the persona, the social mask, so that it can descend inward toward the deeper layers of the psyche described by Carl Jung. To speak too soon would be to cling to identity rather than allow it to dissolve. The heroine understands something we resist, that being misunderstood is sometimes necessary. Silence forces her to endure projection. Others decide who she is. Others assign meaning to her stillness. But instead of reacting, she contains. This containment is not weakness. It is discipline. To speak would relieve tension. Silence holds it. And held tension is where transformation happens. There is also a deeper danger in speech at this stage. When we talk too early about our inner experiences, we often turn them into performances. We polish them. We make them coherent. But coherence is not the same as truth. The heroine's silence protects the fragile truth that has not yet found its right form. She refuses to turn mystery into opinion. This is why her silence feels unbearable to the outside world. It disrupts the expectation that inner life must be immediately legible, that suffering must be explained, that growth must be visible. But the fairy tale insists some stages of maturation require invisibility. the heroine does not speak because she is listening. Not to voices outside her, but to something slower, deeper, and far less articulate within. And when she finally speaks, if she ever does, her words no longer come from defense. They come from authority. Not the authority of certainty, but the authority of someone who has learned to wait until the soul was ready to speak for itself. The spinning wheel does not rush. It turns, again and again. In fairy tales, this image appears at moments when the heroine's life seems suspended, when nothing new is happening, yet everything is quietly at stake. To the modern eye, the spinning wheel looks like monotony, repetition, a symbol of time wasted, but symbolically, it represents something far more demanding, the discipline of waiting. The spinning wheel teaches that inner transformation does not arrive through intensity, but through rhythm. Each turn is small, almost invisible, and yet, with each rotation, raw material is slowly drawn out, thinned, and made coherent. Psychologically, this is the work the ego cannot perform. The conscious mind wants conclusions. It wants progress it can measure. But the psyche matures differently. It works in cycles, not deadlines. The discipline of waiting is not inactivity. It is sustained attention over time without interference. This is why the heroine is often shown working quietly, repeating the same gesture day after day. She is not producing results. She is maintaining a container, and that container matters. When we interfere too soon, when we demand clarity, meaning, or resolution, the process collapses. The thread breaks. The work must begin again. Waiting protects the fragile continuity of inner development. There is also a quiet humility in the spinning wheel. It does not dramatize its importance. It does not announce transformation. It simply keeps turning. In doing so, it teaches the heroine how to submit, not to authority or fate, but to time itself. This is one of the most difficult disciplines for the modern psyche. We live in a culture that confuses urgency with significance. If something takes too long, we assume it has failed. But the fairy tale offers a different truth. What matures too quickly rarely matures deeply. The spinning wheel demands patience without reward, no applause, no reassurance that anything is changing. Only the quiet faith that repetition, when honored, shapes the soul. This is why the heroine's work is often invisible to others. From the outside, it looks like stagnation. From the inside, it is refinement. Each turn of the wheel thins the thread. Each day of waiting sharpens discernment. Slowly, something unformed becomes strong enough to endure tension without snapping. The discipline of waiting is not about doing nothing. It is about staying faithful to a process you cannot yet explain. And when the time finally comes to move, the heroine does not rush. She already knows how to work with time, because time has worked on her. There is a moment in the inner journey when interpretation becomes an obstacle, when naming, explaining, and understanding too quickly begin to interfere with what needs to unfold. This is the descent without commentary. In fairy tales, this phase is rarely dramatic on the surface. There is no announcement, no guiding voice, no reassurance that what is happening has meaning. The heroine descends anyway. Psychologically, this descent marks a withdrawal of conscious control. The ego, which normally narrates experience in real time, is asked to fall silent, not because reflection is wrong, but because reflection can arrive too early. To comment is to stand above the experience. To descend is to be inside it. Here, the psyche moves beyond moral categories, beyond explanations that protect self-image. The heroine enters regions where contradictions coexist, where clarity dissolves, where familiar identities no longer apply. This is why commentary fails. Language cannot yet follow. In the work of Carl Jung, this moment corresponds to a genuine encounter with the unconscious, not as a concept, but as a living reality. The unconscious does not respond to analysis on demand. It reveals itself only when it is not being interrogated. The descent without commentary requires restraint, not acting on impulse, not translating feeling into story, not turning discomfort into insight prematurely. This is difficult because the modern ego equates awareness with control. We believe that if we can explain what we are experiencing, we are safe from it. But fairy tales suggest the opposite, that some encounters require vulnerability without explanation. In silence, images arise, dreamlike, irrational, incomplete. They do not ask to be understood, they ask to be endured. The heroine does not record this descent. She does not interpret it for others, or even for herself. She allows herself to be affected without knowing how she will make sense of it later. This is not passivity, it is trust in a deeper intelligence of the psyche. Descent without commentary protects the experience from being flattened into meaning too soon. It preserves its transformative charge. What is lived without explanation often reshapes us more thoroughly than what is immediately understood. Eventually, language will return. Reflection will become possible, but not now. Now, the work is simply to stay present while orientation is lost, to remain conscious without being in control, to descend without demanding a map. And this is why the descent feels so threatening, not because it is destructive, but because it asks the ego to step aside and allow the soul to move first. At a certain point, silence stops being endurance. It becomes presence. This is the moment when something subtle shifts in the heroine. She has not spoken, not explained, not defended herself, yet she is no longer waiting in the same way. The silence that once felt like restraint now carries weight. Inner authority is born quietly. In the earlier stages, silence was discipline. It required effort. It demanded self-containment against fear, doubt, and the urge to react. But over time, something organizes itself beneath the surface. The heroine no longer holds her silence. The silence holds her. This is how authority emerges without assertion. Authority, in this sense, has nothing to do with dominance or certainty. It is not the confidence of someone who knows the answer. It is the groundedness of someone who no longer needs to justify their inner position. Psychologically, this shift reflects a realignment of the ego around a deeper center of gravity. In Jungian terms, the ego has stopped trying to lead and has learned to listen. What begins to speak through the heroine is no longer reactivity, but orientation, a quiet knowing that does not require immediate expression. This is why her presence changes before her circumstances do. Others may still misunderstand her. The outer situation may remain unresolved, but something is different. The silence is no longer empty space. It is structured, charged, alive. You can feel this kind of silence in certain people. They do not rush to respond. They do not fill gaps with explanation. They allow pauses to exist, and those pauses communicate more than words. The heroine's silence becomes authoritative because it is no longer defensive. It is no longer a refusal to speak out of fear. It is a refusal to speak from anywhere other than truth. This is also where impatience falls away. The need to be recognized dissolves. The heroine no longer measures herself by how she is perceived, but by how aligned she feels internally. In the work of Carl Jung, this moment marks a deeper integration of the self, not as an ideal, but as a lived center of orientation. The ego does not disappear. It takes its rightful place. When silence becomes inner authority, speech is no longer urgent. Words can wait because something stable has formed beneath them. And when the heroine finally does speak, if the story allows it, her words are few. They are not meant to convince. They do not argue. They simply state what is. Inner authority does not announce itself. It is recognized. And often, it is recognized first, not by others, but by the one who has learned to remain silent long enough to hear what truly stands behind her voice. Breaking the silence too early always brings relief, and that is precisely the danger. In fairy tales, when silence is broken before its time, the consequences are rarely dramatic at first. Nothing visibly collapses, no punishment appears. Instead, something more subtle is lost: depth. The cost of premature speech is not failure, it is shallowness. When the heroine speaks too soon, she returns to the ego's familiar terrain: explanation, justification, control. Speech becomes a way to discharge inner tension rather than to carry it. And once the tension is released, the psyche no longer needs to transform. This is why silence feels unbearable. It holds pressure. It forces the ego to remain in contact with uncertainty, ambiguity, and not knowing. Breaking silence too early relieves that pressure, but it also interrupts the process that pressure was shaping. Psychologically, this is where inflation often enters. When inner material has not yet matured, but is already spoken about, shared, interpreted, or displayed, it hardens into identity instead of becoming wisdom. What should have transformed the person becomes something the person talks about. In Jungian psychology, particularly in the work of Carl Jung, this premature articulation weakens the symbolic process. Symbols need time in darkness. When dragged into consciousness too quickly, they lose their generative power and turn into concepts, opinions, or beliefs. The heroine who breaks her silence too early often believes she is choosing authenticity. But what she is choosing unconsciously is safety. Speech creates distance from the experience. It restores orientation before the soul has finished its work. The cost is subtle but lasting. Instead of inner authority, there is borrowed certainty. Instead of rootedness, there is performance. Instead of wisdom, there is coherence. The fairy tale does not condemn this mistake. It simply shows its consequences. The work must begin again. The spinning wheel returns. The waiting resumes, often under harsher conditions than before. This is not punishment. It is necessity. What has not been carried long enough cannot be trusted. What has not ripened in silence cannot sustain meaning. The modern world encourages constant articulation. Share your process, explain your feelings, clarify your position. But fairy tales whisper a counter-truth. Some inner movements lose their life force the moment they are exposed. Silence, when broken too early, reveals less than it hides. And the real cost is not that others misunderstand you. It is that you interrupt the moment when misunderstanding was still doing its necessary work. At the end of the fairy tale, we expect resolution. A voice restored, a truth revealed, a clear moral we can carry home. But this story ends differently. What remains is not an answer, but a question. After all the waiting, the silence, the descent, and the discipline, the heroine stands changed, but not explained. The fairy tale does not tell us exactly what she learned. It does not translate her transformation into instruction. It leaves space. And that space is intentional. The deepest movements of the psyche cannot be handed down fully formed. They must be recognized from within. This is why the final gesture of the silent heroine is not speech, but presence. Her authority does not come from what she says, but from what no longer needs to be said. For the modern mind, this feels unfinished. We want conclusions. We want takeaways. We want clarity we can apply, but the fairy tale resists this demand. Instead, it turns the story back toward the listener. The question that remains is not theoretical. It is intimate. Where in your life are you trying to speak before something in you has finished forming? Where are you explaining, justifying, or clarifying when what is actually required is endurance? There is a part of the psyche that matures only when it is not rushed into visibility. It needs silence, not as repression, but as shelter. Not as avoidance, but as protection. The heroine's journey suggests that wisdom is not accumulated by adding more words, but by learning when words would interfere. This is uncomfortable because it asks for restraint in a culture that rewards expression. It asks for patience in a world that celebrates immediacy. And it asks for trust in a time when trust feels risky. Yet the fairy tale does not romanticize silence. It does not suggest withdrawal from life. It simply points to a rhythm. Speak when something has earned the right to be spoken. Until then, remain. Remain with the tension. Remain with the not knowing. Remain with the quiet work happening beneath awareness. The question that remains is this: what in you is still asking for time? Not to be fixed, not to be shared, but to be silently completed before it can truly speak. Before you close this video, let me ask you something unsettling. Where in your life are you still trying to explain what actually needs to mature in silence? What part of you keeps reaching for words, clarity, or recognition, while something deeper is asking for time, containment, and patience? And if you're honest, is your urgency to speak coming from truth or from discomfort with waiting? The Silent Heroine invites you to consider that perhaps the real initiation is not learning what to say, but learning when silence is doing the work for you. If this reflection resonated with you, I invite you to stay with this channel, subscribe, like, and share this video with someone who might also be navigating an unseen inner process. Your engagement helps keep these symbolic conversations alive and allows this work to reach others who are quietly searching for meaning. Thank you for spending this time here. More journeys into the hidden psychology of fairy tales are coming soon. Until the next video, remain attentive and listen carefully to what is still forming within you.